All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We're going to get started right away. We only have 50 minutes together, so we want to make the most of it. And today, hopefully you're here to hear about making healthy environments a legal right in Michigan, maybe through constitutional changes, maybe through legislation. We're going to learn all about it. So my name is Natalie Sampson. I'm a co-lead for the Community Engagement Corps for the Michigan Center on Life Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease, or as many of you might know us as M-LEEaD. And I really want to make sure we call out that this work that we do is guided by our advocacy board. And this includes leaders from Eastside Community Network, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, Detroit Health Department, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Sierra Club, We the People of Detroit, Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, Ecology Center, CHAS Center, Green Door Initiative, and probably a few others who are in the mix there, but those are the folks who really guide what we work on and our priorities when it comes to environmental health and environmental justice. So this is part of a series, as you might know, called Residents and Researchers, and we're really focused on action-oriented, solutions-oriented research that addresses environmental health and justice issues. So we've covered air quality, disaster preparedness, healthcare waste, immigrant worker health, water affordability, climate and housing, and we'll be sure to share with you the link so you can go back and watch any of those past R&Rs that you might want to see. And I'll just acknowledge that we're supported by an NIHS P30 grant. So we appreciate that support to make this happen. And we're going to jump in. So we have two guests that we are very, very lucky to have. They're very busy, very brilliant people that are active within Metro Detroit and beyond, tackling environmental health issues of all kinds. So we have with us Laprisha Daniels, who is the Executive Director for Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. She's also a co-lead of M-LEEaD's Stakeholder Advocacy Board. She's responsible for disrupting and dismantling the status quo that leads to Detroiters bearing the undue burden of environmental hazards that ultimately impact their quality of life. Laprisha is an MPH MSW, or as she says, public health social worker, and she works to co-develop, implement, and evaluate efforts focused on strategies to eliminate those environmental health disparities. She does so much. If you haven't checked out DWEJ's website and the work they do, I highly encourage you to. And we also have Nick Schroek. He is an environmental law expert. You might have caught him in the news. I hear him on NPR from time to time. His work focuses on air pollution, water pollution, environmental justice, transportation, citizen suit enforcement. He previously served as the executive director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. Professor Schroek has litigated cases for several prominent environmental advocacy organizations. And he is now the director of clinical programs, an associate professor of law, and the associate dean of experiential education at Detroit Mercy Law Faculty. So again, we are really lucky to have these two with us today to talk about making healthy environments a legal right in our state. And I think that Laprisha is going to get us started in talking about maybe some of the why behind all of this. Please feel free to throw questions in and we'll track on those as we go. And hand it off to you, Laprisha.
All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's always interesting to hear about who I am. So thank you for that. Really honored to be here, with Nick. And just to give a little bit of history, Nick and I are working together, or UDM Law and DWJ are working together on a project that is Project HEARD, which is Health Equity, we love our acronyms, Health Equity Advocacy for Resources in Detroit. And it's a project that is sponsored by the Detroit URC, and it is really to help folks work together on specific policy initiatives. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is funded, Project HEARD is funded through the Total Healthcare Foundation. And there are several groups of us that are working on policy initiatives that have been identified by each pair, and each do have a community academic partnership. And so our community academic partnership is between DWJ and UDM Law. And so what we decided to focus on is really the title of this talk that we're doing today. And the reason this is so important, I'll start with saying, Detroit's Working for Environmental Justice was established almost 30 years ago with the purpose of amplifying the voice of community members as decisions were being made that impact their health and well-being. And so we recognize that the communities that are most impacted are best suited to identify what the problems and issues are, as well as what the solutions or interventions could be, and then also best equipped to evaluate whether those solutions or interventions are working to improve the health and well-being of individuals and communities. We know that there are a lot of barriers to that. We do focus on, and all of us in the environmental justice and environmental health space do focus on individual level interventions, all the way to policy level interventions. But what we recognize is we wouldn't have to have as many individual level interventions if some of these policy level interventions were working to the benefit of health and well-being of people and planet. And so really that is the focus of thinking through how can we best have policy that's supporting health and well-being. An example of that would be some of the work that we do specifically, and lots of folks throughout the city and throughout the state are working on, let's say, reducing asthma. But we also recognize that the environment plays a huge role in asthma exacerbation. And so we definitely want to get to families and individuals and talk about how to better manage your asthma, how to better control your asthma. But if your asthma is being exacerbated by air quality, indoor and outdoor air quality, if we can have policies and practices and processes in place that better support clean air, then we would have less asthma exacerbation and less need for those individual level interventions, and we would have a healthier environment and healthier community. And so that is just one example, and I'm sure the folks that are a part of this panel or those that are joining us can think of lots of other examples where if we had better protection, legal protection, and Nick can talk about what those legal protections could look like, then we would just have less of the battles that we have as environmental justice communities, and we could better lean into some of those supports. And also recognizing that the other piece of this work is we recognize that policy can be sort of this big, scary thing that people feel like that's not where I can plug in, that's not where I can have an impact or influence, and really making it more apparent what influence folks can have, what resources there are in terms of legal rights currently, and what legal rights maybe we should be trying to move toward. And again, DWJ was established as a grassroots organization to make sure that the community understands their power. And so better understanding what those laws and statutes, et cetera, are can allow community members to better assert their power and their influence in that sphere. So with that, Nick, I'll sort of turn it over to you to talk more specifically about what is in place and maybe what some of the gaps are.
Yeah, thanks, Laprisha. I really appreciate it, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. And I really welcome the opportunity, Natalie, for the invitation to be part of this discussion here today. And I did just want to say, Laprisha mentioned Project HEARD at University of Michigan, working with the Urban Research Center, the Detroit Urban Research Center, and we're really grateful for that opportunity to kind of work on some of these ideas as to how we can address these environmental health-related problems that Laprisha mentioned. And the Total Healthcare Foundation, they are supporting that Project HEARD work, and so we're also really grateful to them for that support. And again, just thankful for the opportunity to be in this space with you all today. So I'm an environmental attorney. I've been practicing for I guess about 17 years now, exclusively in environmental law. And as Natalie mentioned, I'm also on the law faculty at Detroit Mercy. I've also worked on the law faculty at Wayne State. And so for quite some time, my work has involved around trying to address issues that clients bring into me, into my environmental clinic, where my students work on real cases and real issues with people, to hopefully make their environment healthier and better, so that they have every opportunity to maximize their full potential. And so a lot of that kind of work has shifted towards environmental justice, as Laprisha mentioned, and so I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I did just want to give a bit of an overview about kind of how our environmental laws work and where there are some of these gaps that we definitely need to address to make sure that people aren't still being exposed to amounts of pollution that are unhealthy, which we know continues to be the case. Okay, so we're going to go back in time here a little bit. So pre-1970s. So prior to the 1970s, across the United States and also here in Michigan, environmental law was really an area that was more closely related to property rights. So if I had an issue with pollution in my home, back then the recourse was largely to sue whoever that polluter was. And so you would have lawsuits in the area of things like nuisance. You may have heard of those types of lawsuits where somebody's infringing upon your rights to use and enjoy your property or the place that you live, that they're infringing upon that right unlawfully or illegally. Also the idea of trespass, where there's basically an uninvited intrusion into your property or into your personal space from something which could be smoke or dust or other debris types of pollution from another neighboring property owner. So historically, you would see these kinds of nuisance and trespass really sort of like disputes between, again, primarily property owners, and it could be for a loss in value of the property that's harmed by the pollution. And then over time, we started to see more cases around health as well. So, right, someone alleging that from this pollution, their body's being invaded or trespassed upon by this pollution, and harm is resulting from that pollution, leading to negative health outcomes. So back in the 1960s, we did see some move towards recognizing that this sort of property law, common law property litigation scheme was not working. We were still seeing significant environmental degradation and really bad health impacts from that pollution as well and from that environmental degradation. So in 1963, the state of Michigan had a constitutional convention, which, by the way, every 16 years, people in Michigan, we vote whether or not to hold a new constitutional convention. And so one idea that Laprisha and I have been looking at is whether we might want to revisit some of our state constitution as a whole state. And every 16 years, we have that opportunity as a people to decide whether or not to hold a constitutional convention. But back in 1963, the last time Michigan had a constitutional convention and amended our founding kind of principal document here in the state, they included some language about the environment. I'm just going to read this real quick, so bear with me, but Section 52 of the Michigan Constitution of 1963 states, "The conservation and development of the natural resources of the state are hereby declared to be paramount public concern in the interest of the health, safety, and general welfare of the people. The legislature shall provide for the protection of the air, water, and other natural resources of the state from pollution, impairment, and destruction." So, two important things in our state constitution. First, recognizing that it is a paramount concern of our state, the protection of our natural resources and the wise development of our natural resources. And then secondarily, that our legislature, they're directed by the state constitution to protect our natural resources. There's a paramount concern to protect the resources of the state from pollution, impairment, and destruction. Okay, so that's 1963. We're going to fast forward a little bit to 1970, where the legislature, in response to this constitutional directive, passed a law called the Michigan Environmental Protection, or MEPA, Michigan Environmental Protection. And the idea with this law was to give the people, citizens, the right to get into court to sue, alleging that there was conduct that was polluting, impairing, or destroying the environment. And also the public trust in our natural resources, which this isn't going to be a talk about the public trust doctrine, but I'll just say the idea there is that our water and our air, should be held in trust for our use, but also for future generations, many generations down the line. And that it's the legislature's responsibility to make sure that our environment is protected, again, for today and well into the future. So the Michigan Environmental Protection Act really gave citizens the right to go into circuit court in the state to sue polluters or potentially the state of Michigan, alleging that conduct was polluting, impairing, or destroying the environment, or was likely to in the future. And again, I won't go into all the case law and the history there, but I'll just note that was the legislature's attempt at fulfilling this constitutional directive from 1963 to, recognize our paramount concern against the pollution, impairment, and destruction of our environment. We had this law, the Michigan Environmental Protection Act. Okay, right along that same time, the federal government starts addressing environmental concerns. You know, we had the first Earth Day in 1970. There was a broad outpouring of public anger against our government's failures to address very significant environmental contamination. And this is, of course, right on the heels of the civil rights movement. You're in the height of the anti-war movement around the Vietnam War, the student movement around ending the Vietnam War. So, you know, at the time, the biggest street protests in our nation's history around the environment, the first Earth Day. Recently surpassed by the Women's March just a few years ago. But you know, just to give you an idea of the scale and the amount of people that were actually out demanding action. So all of that public outcry did lead to Congress finally passing some national environmental laws. So I'm sure most of the folks on the call have heard of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, these federal laws that we rely on today for environmental regulation and environmental permitting. So here in Michigan, again, we've got this Michigan Environmental Protection Act. Our state legislature has also adopted the federal Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. We have what's called delegated authority, where the state of Michigan, our Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Department, they actually handle review of permitting applications, granting permits or denying permits, and enforcing permits under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and other environmental laws from this authority that's given to our state from the federal government, so long as our state continues to uphold the law, basically. And so when you hear on the news about environmental permitting, primarily in Michigan, it's handled by our state agency, the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Department, but they have to ensure that they're meeting these federal minimum standards, or else the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level, or you know, in fact, we could lose that authority as a state to actually handle our environmental permitting if we're not doing it appropriately. And I'm speaking in a lot of generalities here. I mean, I quibble, I have complaints about all sorts of environmental permitting that our Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Department engages in, but I'll just say that's the way that the legal structure is supposed to be set up, okay? So environmental permitting happens here at the state level, the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Department, pursuant to this federal authority from these federal laws, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. Okay, one other important thing to mention, our federal laws are meant to be a minimum, okay? So the state of Michigan is able, so long as we don't have laws that directly conflict with the federal law, we are able to have more protective environmental laws or public health laws than the federal minimums. You know, the federal government, they were concerned with having kind of a baseline protection across the whole country, but we do have the authority or the ability, I should say, within the state of Michigan to have more protective standards than those that are in federal law. Now, sometimes you have to be really creative with the way you draft these because you can't conflict directly with the federal law, but it's there, it's a possibility, and something that we in Michigan actually do have some environmental protections above and beyond the federal minimum standards. In areas like wetlands, we have a more protective wetland law than certainly what the federal regulations are now. And we also, we regulate certain types of air pollutants and toxics from air pollution sources that are not specifically regulated under the Clean Air Act, for example. Okay, so the other thing that's really important to know is that our modern environmental permitting system, and this gets at some of these issues that Laprisha raised around asthma and other health concerns. Our modern environmental regulatory system, it's really licensing pollution, okay? We as a state, and I'm speaking, you know, kind of collectively here, we license pollution. That's what we do. We don't start from a perspective of like, we're going to ensure that the environment is not harmed. Actually, the way our laws work, as long as a permit applicant can demonstrate that they're not violating the law or they wouldn't violate the law once they're fully operational, their facility, they're likely to get a permit or a license to pollute. And this could be, you know, air pollution, water pollution, disposal of waste at a landfill, et cetera. So we're really licensing pollution. And yes, we look at, okay, what's the quality of the air around us for Clean Air Act purposes? And we measure whether or not we can allow a little bit more pollution within our region and still ensure that people aren't going to get, you know, acutely sick from that pollution. But there's really long-term health consequences that are still very concerning, even though we're kind of licensing and regulating this pollution and keeping up with these sort of national standards. And the same thing is true with water pollution, okay? We're regulating pollution, but we're looking at, you know, how much pollution can we put into the Detroit River and not impair our fisheries beyond a certain extent, or not impair other uses like swimming or kayaking or boating, whatever. But we're allowing pollution based on the receiving end, whether it's the air around us or the water around us. what we think the kind of carrying capacity of that natural resource is for the pollution. So it's just important to recognize that, we're not really taking a kind of precautionary approach or prohibitive approach. We're saying, how much pollution can we allow without, us falling over dead? And, it's a little bit dramatic, but in some instances, that's really what we're looking at. What things are not acutely harmful? How much pollution can we emit and still, not have, great instances of disease and negative health outcomes? And then we look at a risk assessment, over a lifetime, how much pollution can we be exposed to where we're not likely to have cardiovascular issues or cancers and all that type of stuff. And it's important to note that we don't always get this right, of course, with our permitting, and we don't always get it right with the amount and levels of pollutants that we allow into the environment. PFAS and PFOA is a good example of something that, was sort of thought to be relatively harmless, was in all sorts of products like firefighting foam and nonstick coating and waterproofing materials. Well, now we know that the stuff is actually really harmful to human health. And in fact, we'll do that for quite some time, but the regulations were way behind the curve here. Now we're having to try and figure out how to get this stuff out of the environment because it's everywhere. It's in our water, it's in our soil, it's in our air even. And so I just give that as one example of where the regulations are way behind the marketplace on a lot of this stuff. Okay, so that's just kind of some background and kind of how we do environmental regulation currently. So as Laprisha mentioned, there's a lot of gaps, all right? So, I talked about the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. There are other environmental laws that deal with pollution, but we don't have a really good tool for getting at some of these really vexing problems in environmental law and public health. One of them would be chemical contamination, right? So the regulations are often so far behind products that are out there in the marketplace that are harmful. Things that disrupt our endocrine systems in our bodies that are in our, personal cleaning products or personal care products and cleaning products in our homes. Not great to have that stuff out there in the marketplace, but, often, the regulations are very behind and we have these products that are out there for a very long time. Microplastics is another famous example. They put plastic beads in our toothpaste to help exfoliate our teeth, but we're just, putting plastic in our mouths and then, spitting it out or swallowing it or whatever, and eventually it makes its way into our water after it goes down the drain, and then we've got plastics out there. And so that's just one example of microplastics, but the regulations are really behind on this stuff. And there's a lot of gaps with things like emerging chemicals, things that are out there in the marketplace that are really not regulated to any great extent. And then we find out after the fact that they're very harmful. Okay, another good example, of course, would be climate change, right? Our Clean Air Act is not directly written to address global warming or climate change. I certainly argue, and many attorneys do, that there are provisions within the Clean Air Act that we can use to address our warming planet and to control those air pollutants. But that wasn't what the intent of the law was. It was to regulate certain types of pollutants, again, to protect human health. And so, climate change is another area where our environmental laws are woefully inadequate to address that issue. And then there's other things that are super important, like cumulative impacts. And so you may have heard about this as well, and that is when we permit, whether it's an air pollution permit or a water pollution permit, again, the applicant has to demonstrate that they're in compliance with the existing laws, but they don't necessarily take into account all the other pollutants that are already out there that may be harming people in the surrounding community. And so, and this is, again, some stuff that isn't even regulated, it's just out there kind of in the air around us or the water around us, things that people are exposed to. We're not kind of looking holistically in our environmental permitting. We tend to look just kind of specific facility by facility, and there's a lot of gaps there in terms of chemical and pollutant exposure that people are faced with that are really not considered as part of our environmental regulation or permitting process. And then the final example I'll give is environmental justice. And this is where, from the 1970s on, we've done a better job of, again, licensing pollution, keeping it at a level that, again, isn't acutely toxic to people, trying to limit asthma, trying to limit health impacts from pollution through regulating and licensing pollution. But we've really left out some really key historical factors, including just, where facilities were sited. A lot of this was, overtly racist in our history of where facilities were sited. But oftentimes it was a little bit more, these intentions were somewhat hidden, so I'll just give one example. Wayne County in the state of Michigan has 9 of the 11 hazardous waste disposal facilities located in our whole state. 9 out of the 11 are located in Wayne County. Part of that has to do with the industrial history of Wayne County itself, but also a lot of it has to do about who has the power and who makes the decisions of where those facilities are sited. And if you're a person of color in this country, you are much more likely to live next to a hazardous waste generating or disposal facility than you are if you're someone that looks like me. It's just it's a fact. It's borne out in the data. And so environmental justice looks at a lot of these facts, again, that people of color in this country are much more likely to live next to sources of pollution. Why is that? How do we dismantle that? How do we make sure that we do it better in the future? And then, oh, by the way, how can we make sure that people that have been subjected to this pollution in environmental justice communities, how do they receive some of the benefits, from that, production, from making the car, from, refining the oil? Where's the economic opportunity? Where is the reinvestment in these communities that have borne the brunt of this pollution? So environmental justice, we don't have, again, a specific law. I don't have an environmental justice law in the state of Michigan that I can cite and go into court and, raise those types of claims to have them addressed by a judge. So again, there's a lot of gaps. I mentioned a few: chemical pollution, climate change, environmental justice, cumulative impacts. These are things that we're just really missing in our current environmental laws. So I'll quickly now transition to just talk a little bit about some proposed solutions. Of course, we can pass new laws, right? I mentioned that here in Michigan, we can have legislation that is more protective than the federal minimum standards and, for example, the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. We can do that. In our legislature, actually, this term, they have been making some strides and trying to, improve some of our environmental regulations and, also looking towards getting our state to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the future, trying to address climate change to the extent that we can under state law. Those are all good developments. But the problem is state laws are typically enforceable by the state, okay? So that means that if someone's violating the law, it's typically our attorney general that would have to make sure that they hold someone accountable for violating that law. We generally, under state laws, do not have a citizen's ability to go in and litigate over environmental harm. You might be able to find some sort of, again, like a property law theory for like loss of economic value to your home, or if you can prove that your health is impacted because of a particular facility, if you can make legal proof, which is very difficult sometimes to show that causation, that you're actually health is harmed from X facility, can be very difficult to prove in court. You may have some legal claims there, but there isn't really the ability to just defend the environment or defend public health in any sort of reasonable way with limited expense to go in there and do that. It's very, very difficult. So having a law that we call this self-executing, the ability of a citizen to file a lawsuit to protect their health, protect their environment, that's something that's missing. Even if we had new state laws, we typically don't have it. Okay, I didn't mention as part of our environmental regulatory system, we do have something called citizen suits under our Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And that's where, by following some specific steps, citizens, people, organizations have the ability to hold our government accountable for either improperly implementing the law, like the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act, or not enforcing the law, not holding polluters accountable. And citizen suits have been very important in our environmental law. In fact, many of the leading cases that we have are brought by, environmental justice groups, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, or Sierra Club, or all these different organizations, Earth Justice, that litigate on these environmental issues. They're often using what are called citizen suit provisions. So one thing that we'd like to see in Michigan is the ability, again, of citizens to hold our government accountable for failing to address these, really important environmental concerns like climate change, like emerging chemicals, cumulative impacts, all that kind of stuff, which we don't currently have under state law. So you can kind of use that sort of citizen suit model from the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, here in a state law. And then, of course, there's a lot of things that we haven't even thought of. Laprisha is really smart. Natalie, we've been in many places where we're trying to think about these environmental harms and like what are the future things we have to be aware of, what's next. But we just don't know. Humans, we're really good at coming up with new products and new things that are supposed to make our lives easier and better. And continue to grow the GDP and all that good stuff. But oftentimes, a lot of that comes back to haunt us, right? We don't stop and think and review and appropriately assess what the environmental impacts are of products or materials before they're out there in the marketplace. And so, how do we do that? How do we get some sort of tool, some sort of legal tool to allow us to, do those kinds of environmental assessments, to do those kinds of ask the right questions before we have, again, new chemicals or something that are out in the environment that are harming us. And so one approach is something called a green amendment. At the beginning of my talk here, I mentioned the state constitution and the language we have in our current Michigan Constitution. Well, what if we had an environmental bill of rights? What if we had a statement in our state constitution that said, isn't the legislature's duty to protect our environment? It is, we the people have the right to clean air. We the people of Michigan have the right to clean water. We have the right to a healthy environment. And then that would give us the legal ability to, again, get into court and to enforce that right, to enforce that individual right to a healthy environment. So there's, one of the real leaders in this space, Maya K. Van Rossum. She, founded a group called Green Amendments for the Generations, and Maya's been a real leader nationally in kind of pushing states to think about how they could amend their state constitutions to address a lot of these environmental concerns. And so that's something, Laprisha and I are looking at is, how can we, use our, kind of work through our organizations and try and, think about whether a green amendment is the right thing for Michigan to kind of solve some of these problems. And so I will say it's not like you can just snap your fingers and amend the state constitution. There's really three ways to do that. One is what I already mentioned, which is a state constitutional convention, which we'll be voting on again, I believe in 2026, whether or not to hold a constitutional convention. Now, the issue there, if you hold a constitutional convention, you have to elect delegates that go to that convention. And, that's a political process that is pretty intensive and can be, potentially corrupted by voices that we wouldn't necessarily want writing our state constitution, to be honest, depending on our individual perspectives. And making sure that the environment is kind of top of mind in that type of setting can be difficult as well. So there's that. There's also, by the legislature can propose constitutional amendments and then put them to the people for a vote. So that might be I think the best way to go about it, at least as far as the kind of time and energy and difficulty in amending our state constitution. And then the other is by petition, right? Many of us, I'm sure, have either signed these petitions or been active in amending our state constitution by petition or initiative. Difficulty there is that it now takes over 500,000 signatures. I don't remember the exact amount. It's based on the kind of last gubernatorial election, and you need to get so many signatures to actually get an issue on the ballot. And then there's all sorts of processes you have to go through to get that language approved before it gets on the ballot and put to a vote. So in any case, those are the ways that you amend the state constitution. None of them are easy, but they are doable. And there's a system in place to look at, perhaps having a green amendment added to Michigan's constitution. And so that's, again, kind of Laprisha and I, we're sort of assessing how we can be part of that and what might make the most sense for us here in the state of Michigan. As I mentioned, we do have some legal tools, but we've got a lot of gaps. There's a lot of areas where we still need some, more tools in our toolbox to really get at some of these vexing environmental problems. And so, that I guess I'll just leave you with the idea of, how do we as individuals, how do we hold our government accountable for a failure to act? But how do we also, rather than always being reactive, how do we be proactive? In environmental law, one of the things, like I said, this is my career. Well, I love teaching, I love working with students, but one of the things that just consistently bums me out is how reactive we are in our thinking, particularly in environmental law. You find out that someone gets sick from a certain type of chemical, then we figure out a way to regulate it or how to try and remove it from the environment, rather than really taking that precautionary approach. And I think the balance towards sort of like economic development, it's swung too far in that direction and too far away from public health. And so one way that I think we get back there is through these types of citizen-driven efforts, whether it's a green amendment or some other petition drive or something, to really kind of take back and say, wait a minute, we do have a right to a healthy environment. We need clean air to breathe. We need clean water to drink. And if our government isn't making that possible, then we need to seize the initiative, again, through peaceful, legitimate, democratic means. That's the way that we should do things. And so, in any case, I think I'll kick it back over to Laprisha now, and we'll talk a little more before we get into Q&A. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I covered a lot of ground there, but I wanted to give you all kind of a sense of where we're at and what some of the opportunities are for moving forward.
So thank you so much, Nick. I think we want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So I do want to say, Nick already highlighted this, that we've been working with a group that has been focused on focused on green amendments across the nation. So Michigan does have a steering committee that is working toward efforts to move us toward having a green amendment in our state constitution. And I'm going to borrow some language from them to help us think about why this is important. And it's really so that we're able to experience the health, quality of life, education, joy, and economic prosperity provided by a clean, safe, and healthy environment, to end environmental racism, and to help ensure that nature itself is able to thrive. And so that's the goal of having the environment and environmental protections as a legal right, so that we can all, people and planet, can be protected, and that we can all thrive in the environment and don't have to worry about the environment causing hazards and harm to us as, again, people and planet. And so, am I supposed to pass it back to you, Natalie? Or am I supposed to say, we're open to questions now? I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
Both and. I see the questions pouring in. I'm going to combine the first two here, but so kind of what would that look like? I think there's a question about Nestle. Some of us know the backstory there of extracting water from the state and the state allowing it. And then there's another from a chemical contamination disaster, PBB, that's from the 70s, but continues to affect the community of St. Louis, Michigan. And so I don't know, maybe you could speak a little bit to what this could mean in these instances.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first, and Laprisha, feel free to chime in too. I would say that, with Nestle, so this is now, owned by another company, one of those private equity type companies, but they bottle water in northern Michigan. They bought property, so they actually own rights to the groundwater to pump water and bottle it, and it was Ice Mountain was the brand. And I think it still is the brand that is actually, Michigan water that's bottled. Very controversial in that the permitting for bottled water is really limited. And I think the permit application fee is like $200 a year or something, which basically is all that Nestle was paying, for the right to pump this groundwater and then sell it. Of course, again, they own the property, so there's all these sort of legal rights that go with property ownership, including groundwater rights. But in any case, how would something like a change in Michigan law or a green amendment perhaps address the Nestle issue? And I would say that, it would give potentially what we call standing, which is the ability for someone to get into court to challenge, not just a specific permit question about bottled water, like whether they're, using a pump that's properly sanitized or something, and I'm making that up, but there's legal requirements that they have. But what about, and there was some litigation over impacts to wetlands using our wetland laws on some of the properties near Nestle. But, what about overall the state's, public trust in our water? What about the groundwater connection to surface waters and the groundwater connection to our Great Lakes? And, answering some of those questions we really can't get at under current law. So something like a green amendment would perhaps give a citizen to the chance to get into court, or an environmental organization to get into court and kind of litigate some of those questions on behalf of the natural resource itself, on behalf of the water. And so this is where you may have heard about the idea of rights of nature, and Laprisha talked about this in her summary of the Green Amendment language, but, how does the groundwater protect itself? It really doesn't. The way that it works is you have to have a person with some legal right that can kind of stand in the shoes of that water, but it's their personal rights. It's not the resource itself. So, tools to kind of get at those rights of nature is also sort of what we're talking about. And then the other thing I'll say just on the PBB disaster, this kind of gets at what I was saying about being so reactive. You have this chemical contamination that, look, now we're, my whole life, that's been an issue where there's this contamination and then it, hasn't been cleaned up. People are still getting sick. We do have laws. I think the commenter mentioned Superfund. That's from this federal law called CERCLA, which provides liability to polluters for creating these toxic sites. But that system is also not funded to where it needs to be, especially for the company that created the harm, they're gone. All the money that they made has been extracted and it's no longer available to do the cleanup. So then often the public, we're left with footing the bill for these cleanups, usually through congressional appropriations. A lot of money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill a couple years ago, and in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's money that's put towards cleaning up contaminated sites like that PBB facility potentially. But that's, it's public money, right? It's money that we could be putting to better use, investing in other ways if we weren't going around cleaning up somebody's past contamination. So I'll just say that, it's an old saying, but, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that is so true. We spend vast sums of money trying to clean up legacy or historic pollution, where whoever caused that pollution, they're gone. That business is gone. They've moved, they've offshored or whatever, and then we're left holding the bag. And so I really think we need some legal tools, something like a citizen suit provision or a green amendment, something in our state law to try and prevent those types of things from happening in the first place, because it's always the public left holding the bag having to do the cleanup. Just to bring it back to something I mentioned, PFAS. Now we, the public, we're going to be paying to upgrade our wastewater treatment plants and our drinking water treatment plants to remove those chemicals. It's going to be on us as ratepayers to have to foot that bill rather than, 3M or Dow or whoever else, created this stuff and sold it off to other companies to put it in products. They'll pay a little bit, they're getting sued and they'll pay a little bit, but by and large for us, for public services and public utilities, it's going to be on us as ratepayers to clean up that mess. And so that we see that over and over again. And that's, again, a failing that, hopefully this type of a new approach could seek to address.
Thanks, both of you. There's a question that's coming through the chat, so not everybody sees it, but I think it's an important one. So we know there's a lot of organizing and advocacy happening across the state by different orgs and grassroots, grasstops, everybody involved. But this person specifically, I think, to the Green Amendment effort or the project that I know is ongoing that you're doing with Project Heard, how do we activate, or are there people activated around this conversation? And how could folks get involved if we were to push forward with the Green Amendment concept?
Yeah, so I can start answering that. So there is a group that is meeting. It is a small but mighty group that's meeting. It has representation from across the state. So there are EJ communities, there are folks from the Upper Peninsula that are involved. There are folks from the west side of the state as well. And so we are expanding that group. And as we move toward one of, and I'll say sort of for what Nick and I are working on with through Project Heard, if there is movement toward one of those solutions to have better legal protection in the state, then obviously, and just thinking about a petition alone, having 500,000 signatures, it will require a statewide effort. Any of these efforts that Nick mentioned, or these sort of policy levers that Nick mentioned, would require a statewide coordinated effort. But yes, currently there is a Michigan Green Amendment Steering Committee. I think, Natalie, you already put the website there. And so there are places there that you can express interest and become part of that group and learn more about the Michigan Green Amendment and the work that's happening to move those efforts forward.
Yeah, that was a great summary. And the other thing that I did forget to mention is just that there are other states that have similar language to a Green Amendment that we're talking about. So a couple of them are older. So like back around the time, 1960s, when Michigan had our constitutional language adopted, early 1970s, both Montana and Pennsylvania included language in their state constitutions, basically about a right to a healthy environment. And so now those provisions are being used for litigation to try and force those states, Montana and Pennsylvania, to kind of respect that constitutional provision and make sure that it's enforced. Montana, by example, their legislature passed some state laws that made it illegal to consider climate change as part of environmental permitting, okay? You can kind of see where the political tenor is of their legislature, okay? So then some kids, actually, high school kids, got some attorneys and they filed a lawsuit saying, you know what? By refusing to consider climate change, you're violating our state constitution here in Montana. And at least initially in a court case there, they've been successful in the lawsuits going forward, and they've been successful in a lot of those claims because you've got a constitutional protection there. So New York State recently passed a green amendment, took them several years to get it done, but they were really concerned about chemical contamination and some regulatory gaps there in the state. It was kind of the organizing principle all around putting kind of an environmental bill of rights, a green amendment in their state constitution. So in any case, there's some history for that and some precedent. And so Laprisha mentioned ways to get involved. It will be a big effort. It'll be a big lift. And so we do need a broad coalition of people that would be, kind of working on that. So yeah.
All right, so it sounds like we should all stay tuned on that. I think we have time for one more. I'm going to combine these last questions, and I think they're both getting at sort of those gaps you mentioned, Nick. So is there any movement to change our existing policies? One specifically is asking about cumulative impacts legislation. I think they said New York, but I think it's New Jersey. And then also just is there any effort towards improving our state's air quality standards?
Yeah, so we're fortunate in our current legislature. We've got some real champions that are trying to push for things like cumulative impact legislation, also improving our state air quality standards. I mean, I'll give a shout out to Senator Stephanie Chang. I mean, she's been part of a lot of these conversations, and there's many others. But I'll just say, for years, she's been really trying to push for things like cumulative impact legislation that would include that type of analysis and permitting. I'll just say it's a big lift, right? Now with we've got a split state house where it's even Dems and Republicans after a couple Democrats were elected to mayoral positions in the last election. And so, the likelihood of things moving where you would need a majority vote in the House, at least in the near term, I think is pretty minimal. And I'll just say that, the industrial and kind of big business, Chamber of Commerce type folks, they don't like cumulative impact legislation. They don't like strengthening our air quality standards or protections for public health. And they often fight these things. They fight them, legislatively. They fight them with their lobbyists. They fight them with campaign contributions. And so even people that you would think would be kind of politically aligned with I guess, kind of the crux of the argument that Laprisha and I are making, they're not always with you on this stuff because they've got other voices, other constituents in their ear. Some of them that are really big electric utility companies or that are major industrial. We're home of the big three, all that good stuff. The auto sector put food on my table as a kid, so I don't bash them too much. But I will say, we gotta be realistic about where the power players are here. So those kinds of things like state legislation, it's always very difficult, even when you've got a legislature and a governor that are kind of saying the right things and I think are honestly agreeable that we need to address these environmental problems. But then by the time you actually get to that legislation finally being passed and signed by the governor, it's often been greatly influenced by industry in the state. And so that's where I think something like giving kind of the people more of a legal tool might be an approach that can get around some of that obstructionism that we see from really well-moneyed, deep-pocketed interests that can still kind of set the agenda here.
We're 1 minute out from time. I want to make sure, Laprisha or Nick, do you have any final words for us here? We've covered some history, some regulatory science, some policy, all the good stuff we need to know. So anything else we should know here?
I don't think so. Just, again, DWJ's, the environmental justice lens here really has to do with having as many tools as possible that citizens, community members can leverage to make sure that their health and well-being is being protected. So anything that's moving us in that direction is useful for those impacted communities. But when we have a healthier community, any healthier community is helping the health of the whole, right? And so as much as this is an environmental justice issue, it's just an environmental issue.
Well said, and I couldn't say it any better. And that's, I think, bringing the focus back to really kind of where we started, which is, often things like legislative changes or, changes to like rulemakings, which kind of implement our environmental laws. Those are often done in areas that are not where public involvement and community engagement, certainly from environmental justice communities, just doesn't really happen. And often, again, that legislative process gets significantly influenced by money, power brokers, and all of that. And so, to Laprisha's point, having this kind of citizen-led effort or a public-led effort where we're we're really trying to kind of harness our power as citizens to make sure that, the people that are, most impacted, that they have a voice in this process. And that historically has not been the case. And so that's something that, we're trying to address here too, is that those that are bearing the brunt of this pollution, how do they get a voice to make sure that changes? And then to Laprisha's point again, we help out, one community in Michigan, that's going to help us all, right? We know that we can't always be active everywhere, every time, all around the state, but an improvement in public health in one area, eventually that's going to lead to better quality of life for all of us.
That's a wrap. Both of those final comments, very powerful. Thank you too for being here, for everything you do beyond this webinar, and thanks for all of our attendees. And I threw in the chat the link to other M-LEEaD videos and webinars, and this one will be posted eventually as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a good, safe rest of your day.